Hello, and welcome to APICS Extra Live, Operating Plans That Really Work, with Gary A. Smith, CFPIM, CSCP. My name is Christopher Jablonski, and I'll be your host for today's broadcast. Please note that this presentation is being recorded and will be available at apics.org/extra starting early next week. Before we begin, I'd like to run through a few details. At the end of the presentation, we'll save time for a question and answer session. If you look at the Rights toolbar on your screen, you'll see a questions box. To ask your question at any time during the presentation, simply type it in the box and click Send. And should you experience any technical difficulties during today's broadcast, please call GoToWebinar Tech Support at 1-805-617-7000. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today's webinar. Gary A. Smith, CFPIM, CSCP, is Vice President, Supply Logistics Division at the New York City Transit Authority, a subsidiary of the Metropolitan Transportation Authority. His responsibilities include the operations of approximately 1 million square feet of warehouse and storeroom facilities supplying material to one of the largest public transportation systems in the world. And until recently, he served as Director of Supply Chain Operations for the New York City Housing Authority. Gary also serves on the Board of Directors for the New York City, Long Island APICS chapter. And now, Gary, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thank you, Christopher. It's an honor to be speaking to you today, and I hope you find this time worthwhile. Today, the subject is planning. Specifically, we will discuss a way to tie annual goals to the organization's strategy in a cohesive, logical way through the use of multi-operational planning, multi-year operational planning. Specifically, our objective today is to look at methods to create lasting change within an organization, to use an organization's strategic plan, mission, and values to identify and leverage appropriate best practices, and to develop winning multi-year operating and critical skills plans. Slide, please. Let's begin by taking a look at our typical planning model. I once worked with a manager who simply said, plan your work and work your plan. But it's really more than that. Planning and execution involve at least 3 steps: developing the plan itself, executing the plan, and evaluating, revising, and updating the plan as a result of its execution. You may have more steps in your process, but basically it boils down to these 3 things. Now let's review some definitions. Slide, please. Strategic plans, defined by APICS, is the plan of how to marshal and determine actions to support the mission, goals, and objectives of an organization. This generally includes the organization's explicit missions, goals, and objectives, and actions needed to achieve those goals and objectives. Next slide. The vision, APICS Dictionary defines as the shared perception of an organization's future. And finally, on the next slide, the mission is the overall goals for an organization set within the parameters of the business scope. Now, on the next slide, we see the annual planning process. And this usually includes such things as new program implementations, things that you're doing for the first time, your KPIs, updates and new and revised KPIs, and usually something on training and retention. The key is that the annual planning process consists of discrete programs that can usually be completed within a year or less. These programs are described in detail and usually have costs and ROIs attached. However, as we develop annual goals and plans, many times we can begin to notice that inconsistencies can develop between the annual goal process and the organization's strategic goals. For example, on the next slide, we see that priorities may change due to business climate. Focus and interest may change based on what seems to be the whims of management or due to an actual change in management. There may also be a push to introduce new programs that are not even connected with the strategic plan. The result of this is often that a gap develops between the annual plans and the strategic plan. This can cause suboptimal long-term performance in your objectives. Next slide. So why do we need to close the gap? Organizations have long institutional memories. There are people who always remember the good old days. Many projects, while initially promising, fail in the long term. This can be due to changes in business priority and management shifts. Over time, this can lead to stale annual goals, meaning we just put up the same KPIs year after year, or we actually develop a flavor of the month mentality as management chases the next fad. The result is that annual goals can begin to resemble a patchwork quilt of disjointed programs that no longer relate to the strategic plan. When plans fail, we also see people playing the blame game. And this reminds me of a story. Two CEOs meet each other as the outgoing CEO is leaving. On his way out, he hands the new CEO 3 envelopes, and he says to use them if he's ever in a jam. A couple of quarters later, the financial results don't meet estimates. The new CEO opens the first envelope marked number 1. On a slip of paper it reads, "Blame your predecessor." So he goes before the board and blames his predecessor for the poor results. The next quarter, the financial news is bad again, and the CEO opens envelope number 2. On this slip of paper it reads, "Blame the economy." So again, the CEO goes before the board, and this time he says that the economy is to blame for the poor results. 2 more quarters pass, and the financial results still have not improved. This time when the CEO opens the envelope marked number 3, it reads, "Prepare 3 envelopes." Next slide, please. You see, all plans are blueprints for change. Organizations need to change in order to survive. Our competitive market is not only needs to change, it practically demands it. In addition, global business and politics never stand still. The sad fact, however, is that the majority of major change efforts fail miserably or fall short of expectations. Why does this happen? The answer is in the nature of change itself. There are basically 2 types of change. Slide, please. They're mechanistic change and organic change. Mechanistic change is the most common change and is introduced from outside the organization, usually from management in the form of new programs or procedures, or may be implemented through recommendations from consultants. Either way, it's basically a top-down change or more of a change by fiat. Organic change, however, is very different. It is change from the bottom up that permeates the organization. Organic change occurs slowly over time and becomes part of the culture. A test for this, to me, is whether in order for a change to become organic, is whether or not it's taught to the next generation of workers. When that happens, at this point, the change in effect becomes part of the organizational culture or the way we do things. Contrast the concept of organic change with what is currently happening in modern organizations, and you can quickly see that making lasting change, while possible, is exceedingly difficult. However, successful change is possible. 2 examples highly publicized and highly famous successful change are the implementation of the Toyota production system at Toyota and that of Six Sigma at General Electric. Both took many years to implement, but are now the bedrock of both organizations. Toyota, by refining and updating Toyota production system, which is now referred to as Lean, has been doing so since the end of World War II. And GE introduced Six Sigma in 1995, nearly 20 years ago. Slide, please. The key to successfully implementing change, remembering that planning is change, is to transform mechanistic into organic change, in effect turning lead into gold. The only way to do this is to allow change to be implemented, reinforced, and rewarded over time. Plans need to be carefully thought out and must be congruent with an organization's long-term objectives. Also, the greater the change, the longer the planning horizon should be. Slide, please. One of the tools that I've found to be most successful in implementing long-term change is the multi-year operating plan. Multi-year operating plans take detailed initiatives normally developed during the annual planning cycle, but instead of developing them independently from the strategic plan, these detailed initiatives support the strategic plan, vision, and mission of an organization. They're prioritized and projected over a multi-year planning horizon to provide a cohesive plan of attack that can be modified or changed as business conditions change. Slide, please. The primary reason that multi-year operating plans work is that you begin the process by studying your organization's strategic plan, vision, and mission statements. From these documents, you can then develop the drivers that impact the supply chain. These drivers, in turn, help you identify appropriate best practices in supply chain and how to use them. Finally, the best practices are used to create specific initiatives that are implemented over a multi-year planning horizon. Next slide. Creating a multi-year operating plan starts with a thorough review and familiarization with your company's strategic plan. Generally, a strategic plan is your organization's go-to-market strategy. It identifies the organization, how the organization will utilize its resources in terms of its customers, markets, and stakeholders. Strategic plans are developed for the long term, usually about 5 years, although many can be longer. For example, here at the MTA, our capital strategic plan uses a 40-year planning horizon. That's 40. Long-term planning, by its nature, is fluid. With that, that is why the actions and operations described in most strategic plans are general in nature and don't carry a lot of specific programs. When we developed a multi-year operating plan when I was at the New York City Housing Authority, we used the Housing Authority's 10 strategic imperatives as our guide. From those 10 imperatives, we identified 4 of them that were impacted by supply chain management. Slide, please. Next, review your organization's vision. A vision statement is how an organization views itself in the long term. It's a future state and shows a perfect world, and when properly crafted, provides a source of inspiration. For example, the vision of the MTA is to create one MTA by managing the operating agencies with a common purpose of consistently providing safe, reliable, and efficient transportation service that fosters the continued vibrancy and prosperity of the metropolitan New York region. Slide, please. Here's another excellent example of a vision statement. This one is from Lincoln Electric. Lincoln Electric says, we're a global manufacturer and market leader of the highest quality welding, cutting, and joining equipment. Our enduring passion for development and application of our technologies allows us to create complete solutions that make customers more effective and successful. We will distinguish ourselves through unwavering commitment to our employees and a relentless drive to maximize shareholder value. Lincoln Electric's vision uses descriptive phrases like market leader, highest quality, enduring passion, which is one of my favorites, unwavering commitment, and restless drive. All of these phrases instill pride, and they're certainly a source of inspiration. Slide, please. Finally, review your organization's mission statement. The mission statement describes how an organization will attain its vision. It's the engine to propel the organization to its desired state. Slide, please. Here's an excellent example of a mission statement. This one is from Advance Auto Parts. It is the mission of Advance Auto Parts to provide personal vehicle owners and enthusiasts with the vehicle-related products and knowledge that fulfills their wants and needs at the right price. Our friendly, knowledgeable, and professional staff will help inspire, educate, and problem solve for our customers. While not all organizations have vision or mission statements, many usually at least have one or the other. You can use those when you're developing your multi-year plan. I also recommend that supply chain organizations develop their own mission and vision statements in order to guide their operations within the larger organization, as well as provide its own source of inspiration for their staffs. Slide, please. The APICS Dictionary defines best practices as the measure or performance standard by which similar items are evaluated. They are processes and procedures or systems that have a noticeable long-term effect on the organization and allow us to construct a path toward the present, from the present to the ideal state, as it's articulated by the vision, mission, and strategic plan. Here, for example, is how one can identify appropriate best practices based on a vision statement. Next slide. Based on its vision statement, Lincoln Electric values high quality and technical leadership. With this in mind, a supply chain manager might want to consider such best practices as Lean, Six Sigma, leveraging technology, innovation strategies, and possibly talent retention as best practices to support this vision. Here's another example of how to identify appropriate best practices from the mission statement. Next slide, please. Based on its mission statement, Advance Auto Parts values low price and service. A supply chain manager at Advance Auto Parts may want to consider these best practices in developing their multi-year operating plan. Developing supplier alliances, again leveraging technology, strategic sourcing, total cost of ownership, inventory optimization, and also maybe risk management among some. Next slide. But But what if your organization doesn't have a strategic plan? At this point, your work becomes harder, but it's by no means impossible. One effective tool is to use SWOT analysis. SWOT is an acronym for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. It is a technique that is widely used to determine an organization's overall position in relation to its market. Strengths are what an organization's advantages over its competitors. Weaknesses are its disadvantages in the marketplace. Both of these are considered internal factors because they can be dealt with and improved within the organization. Opportunities are factors that can be exploited to the organization's advantage in order to gain market position or strength. Threats are any element that can negatively impact an organization. Opportunities and threats are considered external factors in that they occur usually outside the organization. Next slide. When your organization does not have a strategic plan, you should always enlist key management outside of the supply chain to identify the businesses and drivers. This is where the advantages of SWOT analysis are truly realized. SWOT concepts are easily taught and understood by non-supply chain people. They can relate in terms of, these people can relate in terms of strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Once you've completed your analysis and have the business drivers and issues identified, it's a good idea to assign probabilities to the outcomes in order to determine the likelihood of an event actually occurring. Doing this will add a dimension of depth to your analysis. Slide, please. Now that we have an idea of the reasons for the need to develop a multi-year plan and the mechanics that go into the plan, let's actually discuss drafting it. There are 5 steps in drafting a plan. 1 is to review your organization's strategic plan, vision, and mission, and identify areas of opportunity where supply chain management can actively support the organization. Remember to use SWOT analysis if there's no formal strategic plan, and assign probabilities to the possible outcomes. Step 2 is to distill these areas of opportunity into high-level business issues and drivers. Realistically, define the organization's operating environment challenges and opportunities across a 3 to 5 year horizon. Usually 4 to 8 business drivers and issues should be sufficient to work with. And then at this point, once you've completed step 2, it's a good idea to go back and do a follow-up and gain some executive buy-in for clarity. This will help you avoid any miscommunication with your executive management. Next slide. Step 3 is to identify appropriate supply chain practices that address the issues and drivers. These best practices should support the supply chain, should support the strategic plan, vision, and mission. Remember that there may be multiple best practices for some drivers and issues, so you need to eliminate any best practices that may compete with one another. Slide, please. At this point, you're ready to develop the detailed initiatives based on best practices. Start by brainstorming potential initiatives with staff. Next, prioritize the list and schedule over a multi-year timeline trying not to overcommit. Normally, you want to avoid overcommitting and limit the list to 2 to 4 initiatives per year. Also, at this point, you need to develop the detail and costs, benefits, and KPIs. Identify how the initiative relates to the organization's strategy. That ties it back into the strategic plan. Finally, develop a critical skills plan. The critical skills plan identifies the program or initiative and changes that are required within the organization. Also, it identifies the best practice that the program or initiative is tied to, and any new skills that may be required by the organization. Slide, please. Here's a partial example of a critical skills plan. Here are the best practice, initiative change, and skills required are listed at a very high level. The key to this critical skills plan, and the reason it's important, is that it identifies what changes are going to be required in the organization and what skills are going to be required to make those changes. It's very important to take this at least at first from the top level, but then put together detailed plans to be able to address the changes required and the skills required. Once you've done this, then you know how best to manage that change through the organization and actually lead the change through the organization. Next slide, please. Finally, you need to publish the plan. A multi-year operating plan serves no purpose unless you share it. In this way, you're on record, and you're also transparent. I recommend that you share the plan obviously with executive management, the supply chain staff, with all departments that are affected within your organization by the supply chain and by these initiatives. And if allowable, share it with your suppliers and customers, at least the parts that are applicable to them. By making the plan public and using every opportunity to refer to it, you tie it into the long-term objectives of the organization. This will help drive the message of change home and to create organic change needed to ensure long-term acceptance. So at every opportunity, you're making sure that you tie these changes in to the long-term objectives of the company. Next slide. In summary, multi-year operating plans bridge the gap between annual operating plans and strategic planning by developing a roadmap for cohesive change. They tie initiatives directly to the organization's strategy, vision, and mission because they start by developing the issues and drivers from these documents. They allow all stakeholders to see how the plan changes and how the change relates to the organization, and by doing so, they actually become part of the plan. And when repeated and reinforced and rewarded over time, the changes created by the plan can be transformed from mechanistic to organic change. At this point, I'll open the floor to questions.
All right, thanks, Gary. And of course, now it is time for the Q&A. As one more reminder, if you have a question for Gary, you can look at your questions box at the right side of your screen and type in your question and click send. And we'll take a few moments for some questions to file in. All right, Gary, if you're ready for our first question, it's how can you possibly plan for 40 years into the future?
Well, that's an interesting question, and having come to being new to the to New York City Transit and the MTA, I don't know all the details, but I do know this. This is when you're looking at the long-term goals of a bus and subway system, it takes a long time to build new subways. And in fact, in New York right now, we're in the process of developing the Second Avenue line, which I believe will come online near the end of this decade. We're also doing plans that we're also expanding our number 7 line that will come online several years down the road. What we have to do is we have to look out into the future 20, 30, 40 years at times in order to project where populations are going to be and how best to serve them. So when you look at it in that perspective, 40 years is actually not a long period of time. Now, what we do to get a bit more realistic handle on that is we revise the plan every 5 years. So the next 5-year group is probably, the next 5 years is probably much more in concrete than the 5 years, than the 5 to 10 year period, and certainly the 10 to 15 and the 15 to 20, and it becomes more pie in the sky when you get out in the 30s and 40s. But that's, in an essence, why we have to plan that far out, because of the fact that it takes many, many years to construct subway systems in this city or in any city, and also to plan to purchase subway systems and new bus fleets and things like that. Because the cars, for example, a subway car, basically the life of it is almost 40 years. So that in itself is a long time to plan for as far as the maintenance of it, etc. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yes, thank you. I hope it helps. I have a bunch of questions coming in, so let's go right to it. How can you accomplish establishing an operating plan in more of a maintenance, repair, and operations sort of environment? Well,
That's basically what we did when I was at the New York City Housing Authority, and because when I was there, we were supply chain operations purchased and distributed, warehoused and distributed all of the material used in the maintenance and operations of the properties that we had in, the 175,000 apartments that we had in our system. And so what we did is we looked at the Housing Authority strategic plan, and I mentioned that there were 10 strategic imperatives that we looked at as far as their strategic plan, and that we picked 4 of them that we based our multi-year operating plan on. And the 4 of them were specifically to ensure financial stability, to expedite maintenance and repairs, to strengthen the front line, which is our frontline people and their ability to service their customers, and also to excel in customer service. Well, when you look at those in the general sense, all of those 4 points have supply chain components. So when you ensure financial stability, we wanted to make sure that the materials that we purchased were purchased at the best price possible with the best terms possible, and then also were stored and delivered to the customer in the most efficient manner possible. So some things were sent directly to the job sites. Other things we warehoused in our distribution operation. Expediting maintenance and repairs, well, that's obviously the goal is to make sure that when there was a repair done, that the reason or if a repair was not done, the reason was not because there wasn't a piece of material there to fix it. And that way, I wanted to make sure that the material was within basically a hand's reach of the person doing the job. Strengthening the front line was dealing with people, was how the operations, how the management treated its customers, and obviously our customers were residents. Those residents needed repairs, so we made sure that they were done on a timely basis. And obviously, excelling in customer service, we wanted our operations, our supply chain operations staff to be excellent stewards of the authority and to make sure that they served the customer, whether it was an internal customer or ultimately an external customer, to the best of their ability. So that's how we did it in our MRO relationship. We looked at, again, we went back to the strategic plan and did that. Now, I'll make a point here is that prior to doing the current multi-year operating plan at the New York City Housing Authority, I did one in 2006 for the 2007 through 2010 timeframe. During that time frame, we did not have a strategic plan in place. So therefore, I used a SWOT analysis to identify the drivers in that process. And again, turns out that there were a lot of similar processes or a lot of similar drivers to the current plan. They didn't change over time. And again, customer service was the key thing. Purchasing the right materials and having the right inventory and keeping costs down so that you were turning that inventory were all part of the process. So it's actually very doable to do a multi-year operating plan for an MRO process.
Great, thanks, Gary. Our next question is, our current version of SWOT uses, and it's actually spelled with an extra T, so it's SWOTT, and this includes technology. Are you familiar with this, and do you include an analysis of technology with your SWOT analysis?
No, but I have not seen the technology portion, but I see that it makes a lot of inherent sense. So I'll look at that as far as including that as part of our analysis in the future. But I think that makes a lot of sense and should also be part of it. Thank you very much.
Okay, and our next question is about sales and operations planning. So have you seen this process be able to be connected to a S&OP process?
Interesting you should say that, because I'm looking at currently looking at trying to do that here at New York City Transit. I'm looking at developing including the S&OP process in this. And one of my goals is this: is that by the end of this year, I will have a multi-year operating plan in place, and part of that will be will hopefully include a plan to implement SWOT. or I'm sorry, implements S&OP. Now, if you already have S&OP in place, I think that the overall, that S&OP, because of the fact that it's a forward-looking mechanism, and you're looking out and revising schedules and plans in the future, you can use that when you're in the multi-year operating plan scenario to help revise and maybe reprioritize some of your initiatives as you go along. So, for example, if you're doing a 3-year multi-year operating plan, and over time you see your product mix changing as part of your S&OP, then maybe some of the things that you've got planned out in year 2 and 3 need to be brought forward, or maybe they need to be reprioritized, or some other project needs to be put in its place. So I think that S&OP definitely has a place in there, whether you're using it, whether it's one of the initiatives you actually want to put into place, or whether, if you already have it, you can use it as a tool to help guide your plan as you go forward. Excellent question.
All right, Gary, and our next question is, what mechanisms or metrics might you use throughout the year to monitor your annual plans?
Well, there's a number of them. Obviously, it all depends on what initiatives you've got that you've got in place. Certainly, some of the ones I've had in place in the past include inventory accuracy, cash-to-cash cycle, on-time delivery, and some of the ones that I posted on the I listed in the presentation itself. We were a couple of the things that I've looked at, and that included some of the other things that we've included, number of back orders in the system, and how much we were collecting in early payment discounts, because we actually had a program to collect early payment discounts at the New York City Housing Authority. So you can use a lot of different things, but another one was inventory turns, because some of your general categories may be looking at risk analysis. Other things may be looking at asset management and inventory management, et cetera. So it all depends on what you've got going, and the appropriate best practice measurements in place there.
Okay, great. Thanks, Gary. One more question here. We have this is about looking at centralized versus decentralized organizations. It's kind of a two-part question. Do you believe that both types of organizations can accomplish this successfully, or do you require something with a central planning department that has the authority or responsibility to draft and gain approval and measure the plan?
Well, again, it's a good question. And I would think that it could be useful in both organizations, in both a centralized and a decentralized organization. And I used the word organization in this presentation purposely rather than company, because I'm in the public sector, but I look at all organizations, as companies as well as public sector entities, as all organizations. But I've done it in centralized when I was at NYCHA, and MTA is a little more decentralized because we've got 5 operating divisions, transit being one of them. Bridges and tunnels are another. The Long Island Railroad, Metro North, they're all different divisions. So I'm not looking at the railroad side of it, for example. But I think that it can also be done within smaller supply chain organizations, in that even if you're part of a centralized organization, if you've got control over your area, and your area, and you're part of a bigger supply chain, I still believe that you can use this process, at least on a smaller basis, to guide your principles and making sure that you're in line with your organization's principles. Now, that being said, I think that you should also look at, if you want to do something like this, excuse me, look at doing it for in a centralized mode, so that you can, if you're in a centralized organization, so that you can have a cohesive structure and not risk breaking everything down into smaller groups. So it can be used in both, and it can also be used as a smaller entity by itself. So I think that whether you're decentralized or a centralized organization, it's a very possible process, and a very powerful process in putting together your plans.
All right, Gary, and I believe we're going to take just one more question. And this question is, how likely or beneficial do you think it might be to change your vision and or your mission after a few years in response to perhaps a change in markets or customer expectations?
Christopher, say that again. You say how likely or how practical? I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. I believe the question asker is asking, like, is it appropriate to change your vision and mission after every few years in response to changes in the market or changes in customer attitudes?
Well, it can be. I mean, yeah. And if you write your vision today and don't change it for 10 years, I think you're making a huge mistake. I think every couple of years, whether it's your vision, your mission, your strategic plan, a multi-year operating plan, you should be looking at that every year to 18 months and saying, is this really what I'm doing now, or has the market changed so much that I need to rethink my operation? And so I think that, yeah, I think that it is viable. I don't think I don't have these, have it for sure, but I don't know how often a lot of companies change their vision and mission, but I think that they re-look at it and make sure that, and I know that we did at NYCHA, and some companies do this a lot, in that you need to look at it based on what your market is, because if you're going one way and all of a sudden the market goes another, you can miss out entirely. So I think every 12 to 18 months you should at least do a sniff test of your mission and your vision, and certainly every 2 years, because things do change. And while I do multi-year operating plans 3 years out, because that's where I think I can see, I have, in things that I have planned in year 3, have changed based on what the market is doing, what we're doing, how we've changed in relationship to our customer, what we're buying versus what we did before. So the mix is constantly changing, so I think that it's worthwhile to be looking at it every 18 to 24 months.
Great, thanks. And I believe that's where we're going to have to cut it off. We had a lot of questions flowing in, so if we didn't get to yours, I apologize. But please feel free to contact Gary at the information on your screen, and we'll try to get to as many of those questions as we possibly can. So once again, Gary, thank you for your time today. And thanks to all our participants for participating in this APICS Extra Live webinar. This concludes...
Thank you very much.
Oh, no, yes, you're very welcome. This concludes today's edition of APICS Extra Live. All content and materials included in this edition of APICS Extra Live are the property of APICS and are protected by the United States and international copyright laws. All rights are reserved. Once again, thank you, and we'll see you next time.